school ethics bowls are extracurricular programs that have just exploded over the past few years. There are now 24 states across the nation and one province in Canada that are organizing high school ethics bowl competitions. And the winners of each of those regional bowls, including our own Michigan High School Ethics Bowl, go on to compete in the National High School Ethics Bowl held at the University of North Carolina and organized by the Parr Center for Ethics. So the role of judge is one of the most important roles in the bowl, perhaps the most important besides the students, of course. And that's because it's you that will be determining which school teams can advance to the next round of our competition, and ultimately which team it is that has the opportunity to travel to North Carolina and compete in the National Bowl. And your job is to decide that based on an impartial, thorough, and critical assessment of the quality of each team's arguments.
Each ethics bowl round features 2 teams and 2 cases, lasting about an hour in total. 3 to 5 students will present from each school, a moderator runs the room, and 3 judges assess the team's performances. The match begins with a coin toss. The team that wins the toss may elect to be Team A presenting first, or Team B presenting second. At this point, the judges should fill in the names of Team A and Team B at the top of their scoring sheet. The moderator will give you a pen or pencil to take notes during each team's presentation. Then, copies of the first case and question are distributed. The teams have prepared the cases in advance, but they don't know in advance which case will be presented during each round or which question will be asked about each case. For the first case in each round, there's a presentation by Team A, a commentary by Team B, and a response by Team A. Team A gets 2 minutes to confer and 5 minutes to speak. Team B then gets 1 minute to confer about Team A's presentation and 3 minutes to offer commentary on that presentation. Finally, Team A gets another minute to confer and then takes 3 minutes to respond to the questions and comments raised by Team B during the commentary. After conferring briefly, the judges then have a 10-minute question and answer period with Team A. Each judge may ask 1 question, and additional questions may be asked after everyone has had a chance to speak if there's remaining time. The judges then evaluate Team A's presentation, Team B's commentary, and Team A's response. And you'll get some instructions on how to do that later in the video. When the judges have finished filling in their scoring sheets, a second case study and question are distributed by the moderator, and the entire process repeats, this time featuring Team B as the presenting team. And that's a round of the Ethics Bowl.
Let's take a look at the scoring criteria for the presentations. The scoring criteria for the presentations are right on the scoring sheet that you'll fill out in the blue boxes. You'll give the presenting team 3 separate scores in response to the questions in the box. Did the presentation clearly and systematically address the moderator's question? Did the presentation identify and thoroughly discuss the central moral dimensions of the case? And did the presentation indicate both awareness and thoughtful consideration of different viewpoints, including those that would loom large in the reasoning of individuals who disagree with the team's position?
To help clarify some of these criteria, we're going to walk you through 2 sample presentations on a real case from the 2015-16 Ethics Bowl. Mr. X is a 75-year-old white male with lung cancer that has spread to his bones and spine. He is living in his own home, and his wife is trying to provide care for him. Because he is expected to die within 6 months, he has begun to receive hospice care. The hospice team are working to keep him as comfortable as possible. A hospice aide is assigned to visit Mr. X 3 times per week to assist him with showering. After the aide's first visit, the supervisor receives a call from Mr. X's wife. She requests a different aide for future home visits, as it seems to Mr. X and his wife that the aide does not understand their needs. The supervisor listens and agrees to make a change. Sometimes personalities clash, and an arrangement just isn't a good fit. The second aide makes 2 visits. After the second visit, she calls the supervisor and says that the patient has been rude and uncooperative, has asked why the agency is sending such horrible people to care for him, and has directed racial slurs towards her. She explains to the supervisor that she had decided not to say anything after the first visit, but that on the second visit, she had found Mr. X even more vocal than before. Now, she explains, she is dreading going back. At almost the same time, Mr. X's wife calls the hospice supervisor and again requests a different aide. The supervisor asks why they are making this request. The wife repeatedly says that the aides sent so far did not seem to understand her husband. Both aides assigned to the home of Mr. X are African American. The supervisor suspects that the patient is racist. Through further investigation, the supervisor finds that Mr. X had used the same racial slurs with the first aide, but the aide was afraid that if she complained, she might lose her job. The question is, what is the appropriate thing for the supervisor to do? We are going to show you 2 sample presentations in answer to this question. Here is School 1's presentation.
Good morning. My name is Zoe, and these are my teammates.
I'm Caroline.
And I'm Brendan.
And we're representing Somewhere High School. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the judges and the moderator for volunteering their time today, and our colleagues at Elsewhere High School for engaging us in conversation on this important issue. Today, Brendan will introduce the case, Caroline will present our stance with input from others, and I will conclude.
Thank you, Zoe. Our position on the question in hand is that the supervisor should remove the African American aide from her position as nurse to Mr. X and replace her with a white aide, because nobody should be subjected to the indignity of racism. It's the supervisor's job to ensure that all of the aides her company employs are able to do their jobs in comfort and emotional safety.
Thanks, Brendan. Right, so the moral principle undergirding our argument is consequentialism, as originally articulated by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And we'll show that experiences of racism have devastating consequences for individuals, meaning that individuals ought not be subjected to it. So the Pew Research Center has found that African Americans suffer considerable discrimination in everyday life, including on the job. A full 88% of African Americans report that people of their race experience some or a lot of discrimination. Moreover, this discrimination deleteriously impacts the well-being of people of color. For instance, African Americans comprise only 13% of the US population, but a full 57% of the people imprisoned for drug offenses. So experiencing racism has adverse emotional consequences, so the supervisor is ethically obligated to ensure that the aides do not experience these effects.
You might think taking her away from her job, that has negative consequences too.
Also, it's important for the supervisor to realize that she's in a position of privilege. She might feel comfortable telling Mr. X that his conduct is inappropriate, but the nurse has to deal with his racism day in, day out, so she might not feel comfortable expressing her true feelings. So the supervisor has to act.
Right. It's the supervisor's responsibility to ensure the well-being of her staff, even if it's inconvenient for her to shift the nursing assignments. That's their professional obligation. So, Aristotle's theory of virtue ethics also supports our case.
It's also important to remember that our country has a history of abhorrent racial discrimination. We enslaved African Americans for centuries, and then we subjected them to Jim Crow for another 100 years. Their humanity was not respected. So it's especially incumbent on white people to respect the humanity of people of color now as we struggle to overcome this shameful legacy.
So, in summary, our argument is that the supervisor is ethically obligated to avoid exposing the aide to racism. Therefore, she should remove the aide from her position as carer to Mr. X and replace her with a white aide. Our argument is supported mostly by consequentialist considerations. We have shown that suffering discrimination has negative consequences for minority groups. So the supervisor has a moral responsibility to avoid placing her staff in that position. But really, every ethical theory supports our position. Consequentialism, virtue ethics, and Kantian ethics all agree that racism is wrong. So we must do everything in our power to overcome this appalling situation, and that means standing up to people like Mr. X. Thank you.
Here is School 2's presentation.
Our view is that it's complicated. what the supervisor should do, because they shouldn't be supporting racism, but at the same time, they shouldn't necessarily be taking the aide's job away from her because of her race.
Yeah. We think, obviously, it looks like Mr. X is using racial slurs at the aide, so it looks like he is racist.
Yeah, so if the supervisor doesn't do anything, like if they just say, oh, okay, I guess he's racist, I'm not going to do anything, then it's kind of like supporting racism.
Yeah, we think, like, if you're a bystander when someone else is being racist and you know about it, but you don't say anything, then it's like you're saying racism is okay. So even if you're not the one being racist, you have a responsibility to step in and say something or do something to say, this is not okay.
Like with Black Lives Matter, it's people standing up and saying, this is not okay, it has to change. But at the same time, we also think that the supervisor shouldn't necessarily be taking the aide's job away from her because of her race, because like that's her employment and she might not have another job that she could do, so it might be this or nothing.
Like the second aide, it seemed like she wanted to not work for Mr. X, but we don't know what the first aide thought.
Exactly, so even if Mr. X was racist toward the first aide, maybe she just thought, well, it's just part of my job, I'm gonna put up with it.
I mean, people say racist things to other people at work all the time. Like, my cousin at his work has customers that come in and make racial comments about his race all the time or treat him different because of his race. And he complains to me about it, but it's not enough to make him want to quit his job because, like, he just wants to have a job.
Yeah. And also the aide might think that when she chose to work as a hospice aide worker, like she knew that she was going to be working with older people that might have offensive views, but like she knew that, and she knew that it was like part of the job that she might have to deal with those people. So now she might think like, well, her job is to look after him, and she still has to do that.
Also, if you fire someone from their job because of their race, that's discrimination.
So the aide might have thought that the supervisor was discriminating her if she wanted to stay working for Mr. X, but the supervisor took her job basically because she was black.
Right. So overall, what we think the supervisor should do is talk to the aide.
Both aides.
Both aides, talk to both aides, and if there's like a third aide that the hospice is thinking about sending, then talk to them as well, like at the same time. Because, like Caroline said, we don't actually know what the first aide thinks. And she should discuss the situation with them and see what they want to do, whether they would prefer to keep visiting Mr. X or not, because we feel like that's the respectful thing to do, taking account of the aide's own preferences, like what they personally would prefer, and that's treating them with respect rather than just sending them out to work for Mr. X and to get treated racially, which is just basically you like using them just for the sake of your business and your hospice company. And if she doesn't ask them, then she might be just leaving them to put up with it because they don't want to say anything because they're scared of losing their job.
Also, she could talk to Mr. X's wife as well.
Yeah, and that's treating her with respect as well, like finding out what she wants.
Yeah, you need to get both sides of the story.
Yeah.
Thank you. You probably noticed that School's one presentation was very polished. These students clearly have strong presentation skills. But remember, your job is to assess the quality of their arguments according to the criteria on the score sheet. So let's examine Somewhere High School's performance more carefully. First, we should consider whether they clearly and systematically address the moderator's question. That's criterion A. They definitely offered a clear, direct answer to the question. Their introduction and conclusion were especially helpful in clarifying their position, that the supervisor ought to remove the black aide from her position to avoid exposing her to harmful racial discrimination. However, to earn full marks, according to the scoring rubric, all key dimensions must be appropriately addressed. So 4 out of 5 is a reasonable score to assign this team for criterion A. Now, did they identify and thoroughly discuss the central moral dimensions of the case? Well, they definitely considered one important moral consideration, which is the harmfulness of racism. They also mentioned the supervisor's particular professional responsibilities. But there are a number of important moral considerations that they did not address, like the desires of the aides, the economic harm that could befall a black aide if she were removed from her position, the obligations of medical professionals to patients, and whether complying with Mr. X's demands would constitute condoning racism. So we might assign School 1 a 3 out of 5 for criterion B. Finally, did the school's presentation indicate both awareness and thoughtful consideration of different viewpoints? In short, the answer is no. Although Brendan very briefly raised the possibility that consequentialist considerations might also support the opposing position, those considerations were never explored. So the team merits about a 2 out of 5 in this category. So their total score for the presentation would be 4 plus 3 plus 2, or roughly 9 out of 15, although of course reasonable people could disagree about the exact point values. Know the Team A's polish might lend the impression of strength in argumentation. Not only did they dress professionally, but they also spoke eloquently and explicitly referred to several moral theorists. However, they never explained what Aristotle's and Kant's theories are, and how those theories might support their position. Their polished style did give their presentation clarity, earning them high marks in the first scoring category. But name-dropping and cute blazers, although acceptable, do not a brilliant presentation make. It's important for judges to zoom in on the substance of each school's presentation and not just the style.
How about School 2? Well, their presentation was not only less polished, but also genuinely less clear and systematic than School 1. Their specific answer to the moderator's question, what is the appropriate thing for the supervisor to do, didn't come until toward the end of the presentation. So it would have improved clarity to state at the beginning that the team's answer was going to be that the supervisor should talk to both aides and to Mrs. X and identify their preferences. The team also kind of trailed off at the end, missing the opportunity to summarize the points that they had made. Especially since the team's introduction was somewhat vague, giving a short summary of their key points at the end would definitely have improved the clarity of their presentation. That having been said, the team did organize their points into a discernible structure, moving from considerations in favor of removing the aide from Mr. X to possible considerations against, and then a careful recommendation. So since their presentation was in fact structured, although they didn't include as much helpful language indicating that structure, this team should receive about a 3 out of 5 for clarity and systematicity. When it comes to both of the other 2 scoring criteria, identifying the morally relevant dimensions of the case and addressing a range of different viewpoints, the team did extremely well. Although they didn't do it in a clear and systematic way, they did address pretty much all morally relevant features of the case at some point in their presentation, including several that School 1 failed to consider, like the economic consequences of taking the aide away from her job and the desires of the aides. And they also did a good job of developing one another's points to build up into a thorough discussion of most of them, although not quite everyone. They also considered general ethical principles and ideas that can be applied to the case, including the importance of standing up to wrongful conduct rather than being a bystander, the professional obligations of a care worker, and the Kantian principle that one ought not use others as a mere means. Notice that although they didn't mention Kant by name, they don't lose any marks for that omission. Mentioning the names of philosophers and their principles is certainly permitted, but teams still count as having identified a relevant moral principle, even if it doesn't have a name associated with it. So that means that the presentation can fairly be awarded around a 4 out of 5 for identification and discussion of the central moral dimensions of the case. School 2 also shows thoughtful awareness of a range of different viewpoints. By connecting the case to relevant events in their own lives, to the Black Lives Matter movement, and to the cousin who has to put up with racial slurs at work, and by discussing they and their peers' thoughts and feelings on these events, they demonstrate an understanding of how views on this case may differ, even among sympathetic people who are informed of all relevant facts. One way in which the team could have improved with respect to the final scoring criterion would be to consider a reason or two why somebody might disagree with the ultimate recommendation, the kind of conference that they recommend between the supervisor, the aides, and perhaps Mrs. X. Although the team shows awareness of a lot of different views on the case, they only present one view on what to do. So briefly mentioning one alternative possible recommendation for the supervisor and explaining why they think that their recommendation is better than this alternative would be enough to address that point. That would have brought the team up to a 5 out of 5 for awareness of different viewpoints. As it is, the presentation is probably around a 4 out of 5 for this criterion. You will have noticed that one member of the team was conspicuously silent for this presentation. The team doesn't lose any points for that. It's okay not to have all team members speak. If it seems as though the team is systematically excluding one of its members, then they may lose points for civil dialogue, but if not, then there's no penalty. So School 2's final score is approximately 11 out of 15. Again, there's room for reasonable people to disagree about precise point values, but the important thing is that School 2's presentation was significantly superior to School 1's presentation overall.
When scoring comments and responses, the main thing to look for is that the teams listen to one another and engage with each other so as to enrich the other team's thinking about the cases and their presentation of those issues. For example, a commenting team might provide productive critique of the initial presentation, fill in gaps, raise critical questions for the presenting team, or they might ask for clarification or elaboration of some part of the presentation. They should not present their own view of the case or their own response to the moderator's question, except as it's responsive given the first team's presentation. The responding team, in turn, should try to strengthen their presentation of the case in a way that is responsive to the other team's commentary. They shouldn't, for example, ignore the commentary so that they can mention things that they forgot or didn't have time to mention in their presentation. But it's important to remember that in these portions of the round, we're looking for a balance between responsiveness to the opposing team and engagement with the central moral issues of the case. So, suppose School 1 says, "Hey, School 2, we'd like to hear more about bystanders standing up against racism, and about treating people with respect, and about exactly what constitutes discrimination on the job, and also does Mr. X have a right to die in dignity? And what if the aides just have bad breath, and Mr. X is pretending to be racist because he doesn't want to say anything about it?" It's perfectly acceptable for School 2 to pick out the most important questions from the bunch and just answer those. The judge's question period is similar to the commentary and response period. You want to make sure you listen closely to the presenting team and ask questions responsive to what they've said so far that will probe and improve their thinking about the case. While this may mean, in effect, objecting to a portion of the team's presentation, remember that your goal is to productively question, not to make your own viewpoint heard. So avoid saying, "I think the supervisor should go and slap Mr. X upside the head, and maybe his wife too. So my question is, I'm right? Don't do that. And while it may mean challenging the team to extend their approach to a new situation, try to avoid bringing up different issues only tangentially related to the previous discussion. So avoid saying, "Hey, have you guys seen that Seinfeld episode where the coffee shop owner only hires women with large breasts? That's like kind of a similar case. What do you think of that?" At best, questions like that are best left until all the judges have had a chance to ask a more targeted question. For example, questioning School 1, you might press the team to defend some of the unsupported claims they make or to consider opposing perspectives. You could ask them precisely how Kant's or Aristotle's moral theory supports their position. You could also ask them whether they think there are consequentialist arguments against their position. Are there any respects in which the aide might be better off keeping her job? If so, what makes the team believe that the balance of consequentialist reasons is really in favor of the position they advocate. Similarly, in response to School 2's presentation, you could ask the following questions. School 2, in your presentation, you emphasized the importance of respectful dialogue. You mentioned the possibility of the hospice supervisor discussing the situation with the aides and with Mr. X's wife, but not with Mr. X himself. Shouldn't he be involved in the conversation since it's ultimately about him? Keep in mind that it's not necessarily a bad thing for a team to change its mind during a round. If an opposing team, or an insightful judge such as yourself, causes a team to change from one well-thought-out position to another, that may just be a sign that the team is seriously engaging with the other discussants in the room. Finally, as you've seen from all this discussion of scoring criteria, there can be a lot to take into account when scoring. You might find it very helpful to take notes throughout the round to make sure that your scores are appropriate.
One last thing. As a judge, it's important both that you are fair and that you maintain the appearance of fairness. One thing that means is that you should complete your score sheet independently rather than conferring with the other judges. You should also try your hardest to ignore any comments made by audience members during the round, and try your hardest to ignore your memories of either or both teams if you've seen them in previous rounds. If you do see the same team more than once, you should assess each performance completely independently of the others. You should also be careful when it comes to providing feedback for teams on their performance. The National Bowl prohibits verbal feedback either during or between rounds, and while there are some bowls, including the Michigan Bowl, that build in official time for feedback during each round, you should resist the urge to dispense extra tidbits of advice outside of these official periods. Be mindful of the fact that verbal feedback is often counterproductive since it leaves teams kind of flustered and it has them overanalyzing the precise wording of your comments when they should be mentally preparing for the next round. But you will have scoring sheets with space to leave personal feedback for teams on the scoring sheets, and all teams will receive your scoring sheets after the bowl, so that would be a good place to dispense any additional personal feedback. Your role as a judge is to award points to teams based on an impartial, thorough, and critical assessment of the quality of their arguments. With that in mind, we hope that you're also able to thoroughly enjoy the opportunity to engage in serious philosophical discussion with a group of excited, engaged, and thoughtful teenagers. And we hope that you have a lot of fun.